already there in place in the legislation. And so all we need to do is avoid that radical departure that has happened and go back to what we know. So I highlighted the first principle of the Children's Act being that the welfare of the child is paramount. And what that means in terms of reviewing evidence is that we should be open to any perspective and any question. We can't sort of make a priori decisions about what is acceptable and what isn't, because then we're placing our own ideological biases or proclivities as ahead of the welfare of the child. And I say that I know that we sort of share a view in terms of not being in favor of medical transition, but I would still, by the same principle, say that we should be able to consider medical transition. We should be able to consider social transition. We should be able to consider psychotherapy. All the options have to be on the table and then be weighed against the evidence of whether they're effective or not. Because if we decided before looking at the evidence that medical transition was the only option, as some people have done, then we're potentially missing avenues of support that could be valuable. And likewise, if we were to say that a treatment option that exists, such as social transition or medical transition, was off the table before we looked at the evidence, then we would be making the same assumptions and biasing it. But if we follow that principle of the welfare of the child being paramount, we have to consider all of the options against the evidence. Now, when you look at the evidence for medical and social transition isn't there. So once we actually weigh it against the evidence, those wouldn't be supported as options. So I don't want to get confused like I'm actually suggesting those are good options. But that's sort of where I was starting from. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that or anything you want to come back on.
No, I thought your piece was very very good in terms of returning the idea of returning to first principles and looking at all the evidence. I think what strikes me through all of it is that we practice as social workers within within employers and within institutions, and it's a very difficult path to navigate when, if you like, a particular ideology is very much enshrined now in policy within that particular organization. I think that's what a lot of us within EBSWA have come up against, throughout our practice, and we're very vulnerable because it seems to be going against the flow of what the organization believes. So those are the things which I think we need to think about very carefully within our practice, and certainly there are many examples within this group where people have tried to practice within those first principles, and come up against disciplinaries or being removed from the case or that type of thing happening.
Mm. One of the things after I read your piece, I was actually coincidentally, as I might have said earlier, writing a piece about Sarah Sharif and about evidence for child protection, if you like. And I'm very active in or have been very critical of overzealous social work approaches to child protection that intervene in families' lives and cause rises in the number of children coming into care. But I was trying to make the case that actually that doesn't mean it's not a contradictory to an approach that says children should be protected from harm. It's often these two polarized views. But what counts as significant harm in social work is a very movable feast, and it's very debated. It's not a scientific fact. It's very culturally determined. It's very at any given time it changes and moves about. So I suppose that what I'm saying there is the same as you, that assumptions can be very it's assumptions about what's right and what's wrong that sometimes is at the root of errors in social work, if you like, that
I agree, and I think one of the issues that we get stuck with, and that's relevant in this situation, is that not all harm is as immediately measurable as every other harm, and we can often get caught up in the ones that are most evident. If you have someone who, say, that is being abused by their parents, you can sort of measure the impact of that abuse more effectively, not scientifically, but more effectively, than you can, say, the impact of them being removed from their parents. We can sort of speculate about the what ifs, but we never really know. And one of the things that I mentioned in my piece yesterday was about in the Children's Act, where it says that we have to gather the wishes of the child, but it has a very specific piece in the legislation that says, with regard to their level of understanding and their developmental stage. And one of the responsibilities we have as social workers, and the parents have when parenting their children, is to help guide their children through decisions in a way that takes a look at the bigger picture, because we know that young people are very impulsive, can get they can neglect to consider the impact in the future. They're very short-term oriented, and so when you have a child who is pushing very hard, saying, you know, I need you to change my name and change my pronouns, I need you to refer to me as this, I want to seek out medical transition, or any of these things that they might be pushing for, and there's a lot of distress and conflict, it can seem very easy to sort of go along with that because you can see their distress in that moment. But we have a responsibility to sort of step back and go, okay, they're dealing with that distress now, but what about the stuff that we can't see right now? What about the stuff that we can't measure? What's the long-term impact? If we go along with this social transition, are we pushing them down a road towards medical transition? Are they able to understand what that means and what the consequences of that are? And it was highlighted again in the CAS report how difficult it is to get meaningful informed consent in these situations because of the lack of evidence about the long-term impacts of a lot of the treatment. And I think from a social work perspective, people are often going, well, everything we do, we're not doctors, we're not involved in the medical transition, so we don't have a role to play in that process. But actually, if we're engaging in social transition, there's that, you know, that very prominent and powerful quote from the interim CAS report was, social transition is not a neutral intervention. And if we're engaged in that, we could be sowing the seeds and starting the first steps on that journey towards medical transition. So I don't think we get to abdicate responsibility by saying we're not part of that medical process.
Mm. Can I just say, Robin, I'm sorry I haven't read your piece yet, but just listening to you, it's easy to see the logic of what you're saying. But I listened to Maggie, and what you're saying I took to be actually we're all individuals, or even the very fact of different local authorities, social services having different views depending on who's actually making the rules in there. But also it's really very difficult to social workers have never had to explain how they are pursuing practice until they're actually caused to do this because something's gone badly wrong. Other than that, you know, we have really sort of it has depended on what is the beliefs. It's more than that, but the stance of the individual social service departments can be so different. And with an ideology like this, I'm starting to think, how could you actually transform the work of social services around children and families in relation to what's actually happening with facing down an ideology that is so powerfully pushed.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in social work for a long time now, since the 1970s, and I'm very conscious of like fashions, if you like, and things that are assumed to be right, and everybody does it, and we must do this, and policies, and legislation, even legislation less so, but in Scotland recently, actually quite a lot. Just changes and being made on the basis of unevidenced ideas about what's right and wrong. And I think, you see, I don't see the gender identity thing. It is unique in some way, but it's also not unique in that social work and other professions, obviously, are kind of prey to these ideological fits, that makes you go, oh, like satanic abuse, or this is happening everywhere. At one point, sexual abuse of children was the highest number of the highest reason for registration on. We still have child protection registration in Scotland, but it was the highest incident. It was seen as being the biggest risk to children and the most frequent and prevalent risk. And now it hardly exists at all. And in fact, so you would imagine children aren't being sexually abused anymore. So that we have these fashions, and we're quite an ideological profession, wrongly in my view. Robin talked about as being left wing or whatever, but the principles of operating on evidence and on individual worth and everybody's individuality are across politics, really. So I suppose I see this thing, and the idea that social workers can insist on knowing whether it's right or wrong, and basically it's been actually argued very strongly that it's wrong to refuse to transition a child, and that children should be removed from parents who do. So it's the opposite of an evidence-based approach. So yes, those were some of my thoughts, that it's not an issue that can be totally seen in isolation, and the best interests or the welfare of the child is a very debatable judgment.
I think, and I think I think the main reason that gender ideology has been so successful in permeating social work is the role of activist groups, isn't it? And organisations like Stonewall, who've have found themselves at the very heart of government, and it's very difficult to turn for the tide to turn when our major institutions, EBSWA, Social Work England, social work academia are more often than not completely steeped in this stuff.
I do think, and I don't know if you guys have a similar view, but I see one of the things about it being social work being so subject to these sort of temporary trends sweeping through it. I can see some signs now that we are starting to swing back the other direction a little bit with the gender stuff. It's early days. I still think it's very heavily embedded, but with the recent court rulings around Rachel Mead and the other one whose name temporarily escapes me,
Lizzie Pitts.
Lizzie Pitts, yeah. With those sort of things, that is going to put pressure on Social Work England to take a more neutral perspective, one would hope. Then the CAS review hasn't made its way effectively through to social work, as far as I can tell, but it's also relatively early days for that, and that only, it's only released this year. And the time for things to trickle down is often quite delayed. So hopefully we will see changes in that. I've seen within my employer, I went on some training maybe 2-3 years ago now, hideously ideological, led by an activist who worked in a adult gender clinic and was 100% pro-medical transition. Shot down any sort of questions of the affirmative model that were asked by people. I found it quite reassuring that people were asking those questions, but And I took it to management and raised it as a safeguarding concern, because the advice they were giving to me was very concerning, that if we were implementing that with children, we were going to cause harm and be placing them at risk. And initially, I got some pushback from the training provider saying, we don't agree with your criticisms of this. And so I wrote, me being nerdy as I am, I wrote them a 1,000 word email with 20 academic references in it. and at which point they came back to me and said, okay, we'll cancel the training. And there's been some new training developed since then, which attempted to take a much more balanced view. I still think there was some evidence lacking, but so I obviously make a note to attend all of these trainings to make sure I'm keeping on track. And I'm actually now consulting with the practice consultants in my local authority about me contributing to the delivery of training on the subject, because through this process they've recognized that clearly I've spent a lot of time reading on it, and I'm reasonably well informed on the subject. And I think that that is basically the process. It's not going to be a quick or easy process to bring about that change, but for the pendulum to swing back and for this sort of wave to pass over us and us to get to a more sane place when it comes to the gender thing, we just have to have people who are speaking up, bringing the evidence to the table, helping people to navigate through it. Because what you said in terms of the activists pushing people, we all know the sort of debunked suicide statistics that where it was sort of pushed that children would be likely to kill themselves if they weren't subject to medical and social transition.
Lunch is now.
Oh, I didn't.
Yeah.
That would be 1:15.
We've all eaten, but we just so you might be able to do stuff. If you want to steam this shit.
Okay, cheers.
And so that has been very thoroughly debunked, and actually the suicide rates for gender questioning children are very similar to people with the comorbidities that we're seeing in that cohort. So it's not a significant risk. It's still a risk, but it's not as significant as that was made out. But when people don't know how to navigate the evidence or don't know the full body of evidence, and they're confronted with a statistic like that, most people are going to accept that and not question it too much, because as social workers, we deal with such a broad range of issues that it's impossible for us to be experts or to thoroughly read up on all of them. We're our knowledge is as good as it has to be for the practice in most cases. So I think that bringing that evidence to light and making people aware of the CAS review and the findings from that, and opening up that discussion, it does come with a risk for the first people to do it. It's always difficult to be the first person to stand up, but as we open up that conversation more, we can help to push that pendulum back the other direction.
Yeah, and doing it safely, which I think you've given a really good description of not launching off into a kind of I'm against this kind of argument, which just being an activist on the other side. So Charles, I think it might be useful to talk about constructive examples of trying to engage and change policy. Do you want to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I can briefly, but within my own organization, I have challenged our policies that exist in relation to gender identity, ideology, and how we support children in the family courts, without much success. It seems that very often you're up against within organizations a small sort of group of activists who seem to hold a lot of influence over policy, and it's that makes it quite challenging to oppose it or present more evidence-based approaches. So that's been my experience. I mean, I plug away at it, and I do sort of put my head above the parapet, and I do very much feel like a lone voice a lot of the time within the organization. But I think with CAS, and certainly I felt more confident, doing that post the for-starter ruling, because the views that I hold are evidence-based, and that there's no sort of I don't think there's any way that I could be sort of disciplined over not holding those views anymore. So there is hope, and I think there is a lot more scope to be doing that within these institutions we work in now.
I'm wondering if councils, because they have got sort of local democracy, and there are, whether that it might be easier in individual councils with forming relationships with managers, and with the awareness that there is some sort of oversight. Even, in Edinburgh, our councillors are almost universally not universally, but many councillors, the SNP and the Green councillors and the Lib Dem councillors, are all completely sold on this business. But does local democracy protect evidence-based practice, or people, rather than, because you're in a sort of state agency that doesn't really it's answerable to nobody, so people can get into quite powerful positions and just so. And same with the care inspectorate in Scotland, that you think, how could that possibly happen? That they would let LGBTY Scotland practically write their policy, not consult with the wider profession or any sources of any sources of not very good expertise or knowledge, but they didn't do anything. They just, published this guidance that encourages children to have bedrooms according to their gender identity.
Maggie, my experience in our local authority is, and I think from speaking to other people, there seems to be a move for trans activists to come into the sort of lower echelons of power, if you like. Local councils, for example. Our local council is very, very pro-trans, and that's not to say this isn't a good policy for us to get involved or to encourage that. It is a good policy, but it's not an open playing field for people who are not going along with the ideology currently in favour.
It's not.
No, I'm sorry. I'm confusing this here. I'm saying, yeah, I do think that's a good idea, but it is that local councils that do have a lot of power in their own vicinity are also open to trans activists, and certainly in Warwickshire, that it is the case that there is a lot of pro-trans feeling, even at that level.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
But
I think that's where the recent rulings with Rachel Mead and Lizzie Pitt come into play at in their most powerful, I guess, because a lot of local authorities are very risk averse, and their reasoning for succumbing to the activists a lot of the time is basically they don't want the backlash that they get from going against the activists. They don't want to risk running afoul of the Equality Act, and that's sort of been leveraged inappropriately, but it's been leveraged against them. And so now that we have these rulings saying actually it is acceptable to differ from this orthodox sort of opinion, you are able to have differing views which probably would have been considered the commonplace up until about 10 years ago, that are now considered minority views, is a bizarre shift. But having those rulings means that we can sort of point to it and go, actually, if you don't allow the conversation and you are pushing one side of this exclusively, there is a risk to you as employers. And I think that is growing. It will be very interesting to see how the local authorities react as they become more aware of detransitioners, because I think part of the issue in children's social work is because detransition is mostly happening in adulthood, we're not encountering it as a client group. We're only encountering those who want to transition. So it sort of gets missed. They get missed as a demographic for a lot of the profession, even in sort of leaving care services. You would expect that a lot of them would be discharged by at 21 or 25, depending. And we're not likely to see that many detransitioners that early in their 20s. You would get some towards the end, but that's at the point where leaving care services are very minimally involved, and it might just be telephone contact every 6 months or something like that. So you're not going to become aware of them. So that's a body of evidence around detransition that just isn't in consideration at the moment, and that will provide, if we can bring that into light, that will contribute to them recognizing the longer term risk that I was saying earlier is pretty much is harder to measure. We need to somehow get that evidence available and in consideration with the local authorities, even if it's just them out of self-preservation trying to avoid being liable for it. Because I made you guys aware that I recently was reading over a court order for SGO where the judge had ruled that a legal name change, a social transition, as part of the SGO, even though that wasn't part of it. And when I was reviewing it, I found that the local authority had been paying for chest binders and things like that. So they'd actually been part of the social transition process.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Wow.
That's incredible.
And I think that with the rise of detransitioners, it's only a matter of time and before we have a legal case against the local authority where someone is suing the local authority for negligent practice for facilitating that their social transition and potentially pushing them towards medical transition. So I do think that that's a missing link in the evidence base for social work that could create a significant change.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point, and it ties in with Cass as well, because she talked about the lack of
Sorry, Maggie, sorry to interrupt. I think a message just flashed up saying it's going to stop recording in a minute if we don't do something.
I think that
Sorry.
might be the Otter one. I've got.
Oh, I beg your
I
pardon.
think
Okay.
no, I think it's okay. My recording, I'm recording to my computer as well as Otter.
I beg your pardon. Sorry.
No, I know I have had unexpected things happen with this Otter thing, but it does take good notes. But I've also got an AI thing active, and I'm recording it just as a.
Okay, sorry, beg your pardon.
Otter's gone. You're right. So it's just Otter that's away. It's a transcription tool thing. Anyway, which means I could look through it and then take out the bits where we've just been talking about lunch and things like that. So, right, so that's for editing purposes. So will this be. Where was I? Yeah, a good point. Cass had actually said about the lack of follow up for people, children who had been transitioned and socially and medically and whatever, and then they just drop off they drop off awareness. Nobody collects them anymore. And of course, that's the whole issue with children who've been in care and through and after care. There's very little actual measurement of outcomes. What we know is it's not good, but they're not followed through in the way that, say, children who have been had like medical interventions for other reasons, like leukemia or other things, they get followed through for quite a long while. But children who've been in care just get pretty don't get followed through, and it seems that children with been through the Tavistock or the Sandyford up here just get dropped, and adults, nobody follows them up. If they don't turn up at the clinic, nobody's chasing them up. So detransitioners would be an important getting those voices heard in social work would be important. I did do an event at the Parliament with the Sunday Post newspaper hosted it, and we had MPs, and we had a young woman who had been transitioned in care and was talking about why that had happened, and that was quite powerful for her to describe the experience of being in care. And it was actually in school that she had been persuaded that she was transgender. because of the LGBTY society and the way that school did it. But so because she was in care, she had no parent to protect her or no, she was actually just then transitioned by the social workers as well, and breast binders, etc. All done in a very almost, yeah, it's like as if there was no questions about it, and nobody should possibly raise questions about it, that this happening. So I think that is changing because people will be aware now that they might be they might be liable for doing it. So hopefully that will cause change. So in terms of our website and what we do with it, and how we can build, because I think one of our aims is to try and advise and help and support social workers who want to do this kind of challenge safely. So it might be useful to think about ways that we could promote that on the website, like practical, rather than just the theoretical or the other thing, to actually have practical approaches that have worked for people. So Robin's experience, I think, would be good to promote, of having challenged a training.
Yeah, and I think it's part of the way in which you keep yourself safe in doing this is something that as social workers we should be very familiar with, which is that your decisions should always be defensible. I'm sure we all work with something in the back of our mind going, can I stand up and defend myself in court if I'm questioned on this? And if you have the evidence and reasoning to support your challenge, then it's very difficult for people to come down on you with that. Like when I did challenge that training, the first thing that was in my mind was like, okay, I'm not going to give them anything to come down on me on. That's why I'm going to reference my emails with the evidence. I seriously doubt that they actually look through the references, but it's going, I'm not making this up. There is evidence to support what I'm saying. Here it is. So they're not arguing with you personally, then they're arguing with the evidence and you're just asking a question. It keeps you very safe that way.
Yeah.
And when that happened, you say that they dropped that particular training provider, but did they give you a reason? Did they accept your reasoning, or was it just a sort of a blanket statement?
No, it wasn't quite in depth enough of a response for me to really gauge the full degree to which they'd engaged with it. But they basically said, we've got one session left that's already organised for this week, so we can't cancel that this short notice. So we're going to run that, and then we're not going to do any more after that. And then what they did do, which shows some good faith on their part, was they said, we're going to be looking. At that point, it was before the government had released their schools guidance, and they said, we're waiting on the government to provide guidance. And maybe once that's released, we'll look at how we can deliver this training more effectively. And they implied that I would be invited to contribute to that process when they were looking at it, which shows some good faith on their part.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've had that response too. Like, we want to engage and we'll invite you to, our review of this policy, but then, it kind of hasn't happened. And I think, Maggie, we've had that recent response, haven't we? Sort of trying to ask, those in government, to look at policy and to give social workers guidance. And the response we got was just sort of a non-engaged reply, wasn't it? I don't know if you want to say something about that.
I think the English response was really just like that, and I don't know who it had been written by, but I don't think it mentioned the CAS report at all. Didn't reference the CAS report, even though we'd written about it and said, and it just talked about what SWE's job was, and as if everything was perfect in some sort of perfectly organised world. However, the Scottish response was quite interesting because it came from the Office of the Chief Social Work Officer, who has been quite silent on the issue, but who did send one of our staff along to a meeting I'd organised in the Parliament just before COVID, actually. So had shown an interest, but not. Anyway, they wrote back and actually invited us to get back to them and said that they want to engage with us. So that's very interesting, because Scotland is, had a very extreme position on gender identity, and we nearly had a law like Ireland, and it's been quite extreme in social work and in teaching, and yet that was an interesting response. But the English one, I do think we have to get back to them to say. Or actually asked to meet the minister, Janet Davey. She's a social, or Dabby, I don't know how you pronounce it. She's a social worker, the minister for children. So I think we need to get back to them. One thing that, in addition to these agencies, and we've got 10 minutes left. Could we talk a little bit about academia? Because we're talking about evidence for practice, and the silence on that side of things is, or not just silence, but anyway, what are people's experiences of trying to challenge because you've just not that long ago actually qualified, Robin, even though you've obviously got a lot of experience, you must have been in contact with academics.
Yeah, I can't say I was overly thrilled about that. I was there wasn't a lot of space for questioning the sort of orthodoxy there. It was very much the gender identity thing didn't come up very much, in all honesty. So my disagreements with my lecturers were more about other topics, but the only real encounter I had with it was quite horrendous. It was a lecturer, the first time we'd met them, came in and started handing out pronoun badges to everyone. And I was the only person in the room who refused to take one. So that's just a good way of raising your head and saying, pick me, I'm the one for conflict here. So, but I think that it's tricky, because there's a lot of ideology in social work academia anyway. But even in the broader academia around this subject, there has been a lot of ideological interference. Like when Diaz and Bailey published their paper on rapid onset gender dysphoria, and it was lobbied to have it pulled based on a very tenuous reasoning, and that was basically activist lobbying to silence research that they didn't agree with, even though there was no actual criticisms of the methodology. And there have been other such things, Ray Blanchard's had a lot of flack for his research. A lot of the people who have been heavily invested in it have got a lot of backlash from activists and been targeted. And so luckily, a lot of researchers are very committed and stubborn in their temperament, so are not easily pushed out of it. But you can see how we have an environment where it'd be very difficult for people to choose to pursue research and writing on this subject. And I can only imagine that in social work academia, that is made more apparent by the general ideological bias of the profession.
Yeah, and I think we've had members of this organization, who are students, who've been put in very vulnerable positions, during practice placements and so on. So I think it's going to be a long time before social work academia, reforms itself, and the findings of Cass and so on, filter down, really.
Yeah, the silence is pretty. I mean, because I know personally that a number of sort of quite senior academics don't agree with it, but they have said nothing. And I don't understand. I can't understand that, because I mean, I do understand why they're doing it, and it is purely for issues of self-protection and career advancement. But it seems to me indefensible. you know, like we were saying earlier, could you defend yourself in court? Could you do? I don't think that's defensible. It's not defensible behavior. And amongst people who are senior and could actually have an influence. Although I do know from other people I know in social work teaching, it, like Robin said, it doesn't actually come up a lot necessarily. It's not like it's being talked about all the time, and not all lecturers are into pronouns and all this kind of thing. So you could choose to just try and ignore it, but it seems to me a big lack and something that people should be ashamed of, I suppose.
But this is where the sort of new media is so powerful, though. You know, we're having this discussion now, which means we can put that out without going through the sort of roots of academia to have those things. And Substack is amazing for that. There's loads of people who are writing on the subject on Substack. I know that I've been I've written very little publicly, but that's more because I tend to start writing things and not finish them, and then life gets in the way. But I'm sort of endeavoring to be more proactive with that and consistent, because I think that we need that information out there, and we need an alternative perspective being offered, because at the moment, the only people who are having the main voices who are sort of pushing and offering a model for working with these young people are pushing the affirmation model.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
when we're getting that information out there and being like, here's an alternative, here's a way that's actually consistent with what we've always been doing, that's developmentally informed and trauma informed, and understanding the complexities that go into the matter, then that will I think that approach will probably feel quite intuitive to a lot of social workers anyway. So putting it out there should hopefully give people at least an option, and we don't have to go through academia to achieve that.
Yeah, true.
That's a very good point.
Yeah. So we're nearly up to an hour. So is there anything we should talk about or could have covered or want to go back on and just add to before we close? And
I don't think so. I mean, we've got a couple of academics in the group, haven't we? And perhaps
yes.
if we had another discussion of this nature, we could make sure they were part of it, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, we could actually have a discussion on teaching and social work. We have got yeah. And how to get this, like, should we do Substack more or at all? I've got a Substack that I started, like Robin. I start, you know, I put something on it, and I've got a website with loads of stuff on it. And should I just put it all there? Should EBSWA engage? Because, or should we put a lot more effort into getting our website more better stuff?
Yeah,
and,
I was going to ask about the website. I'm guilty of not actually visiting it very often at all. But I'm wondering if it's structured in such a way that we can get this sort of thing out and raise ideas and discourse, you know, with members.
Yeah, well, it's got the capacity, and the site's got a space for our previous webinars are on it, and we could do it. It's just like it doesn't get a lot of traffic, and I mean, I'm not like, I think I'm the only one that actually does anything about promoting it or putting things on it.
Oh dear.
Yeah, I know. And we were supposed to have training on it, but so
I need that training.
Well, so as a group of people could actually
yeah.
And it's actually because it's not that difficult, but yeah, but we need, in terms of promoting what you're doing, I'm not a big you know, social media marketer. It needs somebody that's got sort of different skills, or which I don't have, and we need to have more people. If people went to the website more often and then posted things up about it, and you know, but Robin's
I have that message.
Yeah, social media and bypassing, you know, the bypassing official channels is a good one, I think.
For sure.
Okay, well, I've been a good enough discussion, I think. I'll see what it looks like in the summary and what it sounds like on the on the track, but there's no rush about putting it out. But I think it would be quite good if we did actually have maybe the webinars again and host speakers and actually do it as a visual thing. Yeah. So
Yeah,
right,
Great. Yeah.
that would be good. So
definitely.
we should have some talk about how to do that, like who to invite and stuff. Right. Okay. Right. Well, thanks very much, everybody. Get on
And
with
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Nice to see you all.
And you.
Take care.
Nice to
Bye-bye.
meet you. Yep.
Bye-bye.
Bye.